So it wasn't a patsy question, because what we're marking out is actually we have a different view of revenue and spending from the Labour Party, and if you look at the commitment in the budget responsibility rules, we said that we would spend the long run average about 30% of GDP. Now currently, under the last set of information we have was the haifu, we're running at about 28.5%. It actually leaves about up to $4 billion available before you even hit the 30% cap that's outlined in the budget responsibility rules.
So you're saying the government could be spending more on these promises?
Yes, we could. We could be spending more on this massive infrastructure deficit that we've got if essentially we had said that we were prepared to raise more revenue. Now I know that we've got the tax working group, and that's a good thing. We're really pleased with the terms of reference, but clearly, what we're seeing now that we're in government, there is just a massive hole that needs to be covered, and I think that actually the Labour Party probably should have left a bit more room to move in terms of additional revenue to cover that gap.
So you're saying we should be, instead of borrowing more, taxing more to fill that gap?
Well, you can do it either way, right? But no, the budget responsibility rules, which we were a part of, laid out that we said that we would give ourselves room to spend the long run average of 30% of GDP, right? If you look at the haifu, which is the last set of published accounts for the government, and which of course will be outdated by the budget, but the haifu spending was running at about 28.5%. Now that leaves about 1.5%. That obviously doesn't sound like a lot until you realise that 1.5% of GDP is about $4 billion. So actually, under the budget responsibility rules, there is actually room to spend a bit more money on these kind of crises that we're starting to see in health and education.
Looking back at some of those budget responsibility rules, specifically around getting debt to around 20% of GDP by 2021, 2022, do you think that it was a mistake committing to that now, given some of the funding pressures that the government has come under?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that under the budget responsibility rules, if we'd been prepared to raise the revenue, that we would actually have a significant amount more capacity for additional spending without needing to cut into that debt target. There is a debate to be had around the debt target. We settled on that 20% over a slightly longer time period. I guess as a bit of a judgment call. But given what we now know, later in the term we might want to review that.
But was it a mistake?
No, I don't think it was a mistake at all. I think that. Yeah, there are two ways to do this. One of which is through revenue, and the other of which is through debt. Ultimately, you end up using revenue to pay debt. So it's sort of a judgment call about where that balance lies.
Are you and your co-leader on the same page on that, on whether it was a mistake or not?
Yeah, look, there's a debate about the budget responsibility rules, obviously, but we always said that we would review them during this term of government, particularly once we got a look at what was under the hood. Now that we're kind of getting a look under the hood, actually, we will want to review those closer to the next election.
So when it comes to the review, what would your position be?
Well, let's give it a bit of time, right? We're literally 6 months into a 36-month term. We're not planning on having that review immediately. You've got to get through this budget, probably the next budget, and see how things go. We said that we would stick with this for this parliamentary term. It might end up being the same in the next parliamentary term, but you've got to leave yourself flexibility to see how circumstances change. It would be silly to, have a set of rules that lasted through all time based on a set of economic conditions that change over time.
On wakajumping, has your policy committee, the Green Party policy committee, at all considered maybe adding on a 4% threshold lowering to that bill?
Well, the 4% threshold change is part of the recommendations of the Electoral Commission. Sorry, I'll say that again. So the 4% threshold change was one of the recommendations of the Electoral Commission when it did its review. We always said that those recommendations ought to be enacted in whole, even though some of them, I would say, aren't all that convenient for the Green Party. Actually, they were the recommendations of the Commission. I think that we should implement them.
But
I don't think that should be done as part of this that bill. It's just, if you say it's a separate issue, right? So
that hasn't come up in your policy subcommittee at all, going, or have we got to swallow this dead rat?
We've had a conversation about the recommendations of the Electoral Commission. We'd like to see those advanced, but I think that's a separate issue from that.
Would it make sense given there's so much worry about smaller parties losing out in this legislation, would it make sense to maybe make it a little bit easier for a smaller party to exist?
Look, I think, I actually said, this is a personal opinion, right? But I actually said to the Electoral Commission when they were doing the review that one of the things that we need to take a look at is whether the settings of MMP encourage or discourage pluralism in Parliament, and it would seem that it does not, right? Because the number of parties in Parliament is getting fewer rather than greater, and so I actually don't think personally that the recommendations of the Electoral Commission actually went far enough. They were quite a conservative set of recommendations, and I thought that they should go a bit further.
Under 3?
Oh no, actually I had an entirely different view, which was that you could increase pluralism by introducing ranked ballots, i.e. that you rank the parties that you prefer, and you rank the candidates that you prefer for your electorate, and that would give you a much more genuine sense of where people's actual preferences lay.
Cool.
Just back quickly on the debt repayment track, Grant Robertson said yesterday essentially you guys did a year for housing, a year to restart payments back for super. Should we be doing another year for health? For the health sector?
Sorry.
Should we be adding a year to that debt repayment track, so by 22-23 rather than 21-22, whatever it is?
Well, I think that it's important to keep your commitments, right? And so we made a series of commitments with the budget responsibility rules for this parliamentary term, and we said that we would review it as it goes. Now, clearly it is emerging that the last government hid all sorts of problems and weren't completely straight with the public about, at what cost their drive towards a surplus was coming, even though many people were experiencing it, sort of personally. Like I said, I actually think that there is room to make a big dent on some of those problems if we actually just did what we said that we could do in the budget responsibility rules. Because it does give you capacity to do that. So there is essentially a voluntary straitjacket on revenue, and that creates some downward pressure on spending. Frankly, I don't think that you would necessarily need to change any of the budget responsibility rules in this term in order to be able to make a big dent on some of those promises.